very nice to have some folks here that are interested in thinking about what an exit would look like for your business, especially coming from the games perspective, which is where I come from. My first experience at Casual Connect was when Sandlight Games sponsored the very first Casual Connect in Bellevue, Washington. I started the business in about 2002, grew it to a fairly large developer and publisher, and sold it into 2011. And then started another studio, did some angel investing, did some advising, still on the board of a couple of companies, and decided to join Quorum Group, which is a M&A bank. We only focus on sell side, right? So I was one of the weird CEOs that actually enjoyed selling my company. My background was really all games, starting in 1994 when I joined Kesmai. I don't know if you guys know games like Air Warrior and multiplayer BattleTech, kind of original multiplayer. Very, very old school games, I guess you can call them that. But then I joined Monolith, worked on games like Blood and Shogo and others like that. And by the time 2002 rolled around, decided to start my own company. And then in 2011, actually built it into a business that was sellable, sold it to Digital Chocolate then. So back to Quorum, our focus is very much on selling businesses, selling high technology companies, and that includes game companies. And I'll talk about some of those game transactions in a second. So we've been doing it as Quorum. We've been doing it for about 30 years. We've sold more tech companies than anyone else, and that's across the entire sector of software, including games. A couple of transactions, recent transactions. Liu buying Digital Extremes. That was a deal in 2015. That closed then, and then both the first two are transactions with a Chinese buyer. Jagex Game Studio being acquired by Zhongji, and that was in 2016. And in 2017, I actually led the transaction of Punters, which was a affiliate wagering site selling to News Corporation. So across both wagering and games. These are just a sampling of the last transactions that were worked on. And specifically in games, there are obviously others in other categories. So the focus of my talk today is really thinking about when and why you would sell, and what do you have to do to prepare for the sale. So there are different reasons why sellers sell. Obviously, the main one is some kind of liquidity. For me, I ran my company for about 9 years. I did it out of my own pocket. I actually ended up raising a round. But then, there comes a time after mortgaging your house twice, you decide, well, this is, you've grown the business to a certain level and you want to get a return on your investment. Sometimes there are conflicts between partners, employees, family, and board investors. Not everyone's on the same page. I think getting an exit would obviously solve a lot of some of these conflicts. Fatigue. It takes a long time to build a business and to really monetize it, and to finally, at a certain point, you feel like, okay, I really need to think about selling. But, and we'd like to see this, sometimes it's a growth and opportunity story. You recognize that as a small business, you only have certain resources that you have to be able to invest into the growth of your business. You are thinking strategically. In the hands of somebody else that can invest X dollars in customer acquisition, it would determine in Y revenue opportunity. So that upside potential and that enthusiasm for the business moving forward, I think, is a very critical step when you think about trying to sell, because it's one that you don't really consider. Right? You're like, oh, I want to sell the business, I want to make some money. But the buyer has to have a reason for buying your business in the first place. And if you believe that in the hands of an acquirer it could be a very, very strong concern, you can prove that, you can show that, and that's a reason to sell. And that's a good reason to sell. So we have at Quorum something called the 8 stages of an optimal outcome. And the first time I actually saw this slide in this presentation, this is a sampling of the presentation called the Selling Up, Selling Out Conference. The first time I saw it was actually after I sold my company. So I looked at it, I said, God, I wish I saw that before I went down the path of doing it myself. So The part that is really, really critical, and that's why I focus on it over and over and over and over again, is preparation. Because if you're not prepared, I would probably say 70 to 80% of failures happen during the preparation phase because you're not prepared, right? You don't have a data room. You don't have all your contracts in a way that is actually possible for someone to come in and buy you. You know, you need to think about the process of M&A and really running your company with a vision toward M&A as a process, as a, you know, it's like any type of schedule that we'll put together for a game or a product. You need to set your tasks. You need to have a timeline for those tasks. You need to allocate resources accordingly. You need to conduct an internal due diligence. How many of you guys looked at your distribution contracts or your employment agreements and taken a look that the assignment clauses of whatever is in those agreements can be transferred to a buyer? If you haven't, you need to take a look at that. It's very important. Because if that's not something that is easily done, it can slow down the process and it can potentially crater a transaction. We had a company that actually was in due diligence. Well, actually, it wasn't in due diligence. It was signed. The agreement to sell the company was signed, but the closing was contingent upon actually transferring some of these agreements over to the buyer, and the transfer clause was just very, very poorly written. Right, or actually it was non-existent. You couldn't transfer it. That whole process ended up taking about 18 months. So this is kind of the battle scar tissue that we have here that hopefully you can learn from. And so begin collecting due diligence materials. There are, and I'll talk about a sample due diligence kind of spreadsheet or list that is usually made available from a buyer. But we have a sample one, and you look at that and put together a data room and actually start populating the data room with that information. Just by percentages. Okay, you've got a buyer. I'm interested in buying you. That happens all the time. Unfortunately, only 11% of those types of inquiries land in a transaction. Just because they say they want to buy you doesn't mean that they will. 48% is what you have an average improvement from first offer with an auction process. When you have, and an auction process is basically when you have more than one. When you have 2 or 3 or 4 potential buyers or buyers that are actually putting together a letter of intent to acquire your business. And usually about a 75% lift in value from another firm wanting to buy you from that initial offer. This is an 80% failure rate in M&A. You know, I hate to say it, but Sandlot Games was the poster child for that 80% because we did have 5 processes that we went through. The last one was absolutely very, very quick, but you know, it took a lot for me to learn along the way. You know, some of the mistakes were mine, and some of the mistakes were really the buyers. But you really need to know what is going to happen every step along the way to really make sure that this thing actually succeeds. And obviously, 100% of deals that are involving only one buyer are suboptimal. What I mean by suboptimal, it's not necessarily in price. It could be in structure. It could be in earnout. It could be the way that it's structured and you're retaining your employees. Prepare your company for sale. Make sure all your due diligence, internal due diligence is done, like I mentioned. Go through your contracts, make sure those assignment clauses. Make sure the employees or the contractors that are working on your company are actually transferring the IP to your company, right? Game companies are valued for the IP that they actually have. And if you don't have that IP, that's going to guaranteed to crater any deal. Make sure you pay your taxes. And the last one is really important. Make sure you can live with the deal after closing. And that's something you have to be aware of. You know, all of a sudden, you're no longer your own boss, right? You can't come into work at 11 a.m. Oh, you know, I'm going to change the game, so, you know, we're fighting goats instead of chickens. Okay? There's, you know, other levels of approval that you have to go through. You're going to be part of an organization. Are you ready for that? Do you want that? Right? Because that is a consequence of selling your company. You're going to be rolled up to a larger entity. However, if you prepared well, that can generate good deals. And bad preparation, sometimes bad deals, sometimes no deals at all. Planning is key to being valued in a higher way, right? And that preparation needs to start now. While you're forming your company, while you started your company, get into the habit of actually doing a quarterly review of all your contracts, of everything that you've done, to make sure that you're ready. And frame company agreements with M&A in mind. Like I said, assignment clauses, IP transfer. So during due diligence is when a buyer comes in and starts to actually ask for information from you, right? You need to deal with problems right away. Your highest point or your biggest point of leverage is right at the very beginning of an M&A process, right? If you come in last day, right before you close, and you say, hey, I had this employee conflict thing I forgot to tell you about. I hope it's okay. It's not. It can crater your deal. However, the buyer is most excited at the time that they actually start the process with you. So if you ask the question on the first day of due diligence, the answer would be, oh, thanks for telling us. Good to know. And by the way, we appreciate your honesty. We trust you a lot more now. So let's talk about a typical buyer's checklist. Buyers do use a buyer's checklist, and in the games industry, they're fairly straightforward. They're fairly similar to one another, right? But if you're being bought by a non-tech buyer, or say a Chinese buyer that has now become a tech buyer, or a tech buyer that is not familiar with the games industry, it may have a lot of irrelevant information. The last thing you want to do is to say, thank you for your due diligence checklist. It's crap. Here's ours. Ours is much better, right? It is absolutely okay for you to say certain things within that checklist, such as, that's not applicable to our company, and here's why. So obviously, usually the first thing that you have on a due diligence checklist is your corporate and legal structure. What is your structure like, right? Bylaws, minutes, changes in corporate structure, your shareholder cap table, financial data, right? You need 3-year projections and also your entire history of financial data. Your tax status and your contracts, your insurance and litigation, any pending litigation, obviously, or any litigation that has been settled. Employee relations and property. IP, and this is probably the most critical area, especially in a games company. Markets and competition. If you have competitors within your particular genre that are much bigger than yours, you should talk about them. And as I mentioned, the timing is critical as to how you actually release that information to the buyer. If you go out there and you say, you know what, I'm going to give you a list of all my users, right? Because that's what you're asking for. Or you're asking for some really, really sensitive things, right? I've got some sort of preferential deal with Apple. Yeah, let me share that with you. No, you don't. Sometimes it's actually better to share those things even after you sign the agreement. Okay, this agreement is signed. I will now release this information to you as a condition precedent on close. Here are some secure rooms we use internally at Quorum. We use Secure Docs. It's brilliant. It's dual factor authentication, right? You go in and you can actually put your stuff in there, and you can actually track who's in the data room. One time with the Punters boys, they were asking, why I haven't heard from news in about a week. I said, well, let me go into this, the data room and see what's going on. I went into the data room, and I saw that about 10 people were just bumping around there, pulling documents, really active. So I said, look, you have nothing to worry about. Things are moving along just fine. Make sure your proper record keeping. If you've got board minutes, make sure those board minutes are kept up to date. Sometimes audits are required in games companies, depending on the size of the transaction. As far as financial statements, you've got to have your past financial statements. And, to actually get in the process, you need the last 3 years, but you're going to have all the financial statements from inception. And also future projections. Build a bottom-up model, right? So you've got, in the mobile games, you've got this LTV model that we all use that's based on actual data from past performance of games. Anything that's around like, well, right now we believe that we're 0.5% of the market share in Indonesia. Next year we're going to be about 10% of market share in Indonesia. That's not a model. That's a guess. Build a model, bottom-up model that actually traces how you're actually going to succeed with your numbers. Because at the end of the day, you are going to be held to those numbers. Because if there is some sort of earnout associated with those numbers, you're going to be, if you don't hit it, you don't actually have the earnout to take, right? So all of a sudden, a consideration of that transaction is no longer yours because you were just too aggressive in your projections. So here's an example, right? M&A folks in corporations and also in private equity firms, we like charts. So we look at the chart on the left, and it doesn't really pass what we call the laugh test. It's just too aggressive. The one on the right is too conservative. Why should I buy you? And that's a defensible rate of growth there for the 3 years. And a couple of notes on game company specific preparation. As I mentioned, do you own your IP? Is it free and clear? Really critical. How recurring is your revenue? Is it predictable? What's your lifetime value? What's your lifetime value by geo, right? By customer type? What's your cost of acquisition? What are particular geographic concentrations of revenue that you have? Or maybe of penetration? Team strengths and bios. This is a really critical point. They are team-driven acquisitions. That's all I have. This is my emails on there, my phone number as well. So feel free to call me, email me, talk any point. Happy to be here. I think for year number 6 or 7 or 10. I can't remember how many times I've been at this conference, but always happy to be here. Thanks again.
You mentioned preparation and how important that is, preparing documents and from the inception almost. For me, when I speak to some clients, they're always very concerned that a potential M&A would upset their staff, that staff do not like the change, that it would create pushback, and then they keep it almost like a level 1 state secret sort of thing. Yeah. And that sometimes leads to them not doing the preparation that they ought to. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. When I went through the process, it's a bit like walking a tightrope, right? So you have to almost, and this is where preparation is also key. Think about how the funnel is going to get opened up within your organization of that information sharing, right? So you don't need to pull in your entire team and start saying, hey, we're selling the company today. Most likely that will actually result in a breach of confidentiality by one of the employees that is going to, once again, crater the transaction. So, but you want to take steps in the right direction. Usually what happens by the time the LOI is signed, you've got all of the upper management that is aware of what's going on. And further into discovery, as folks are starting to actually arrive at the office and look at some of the documents, you need to actually position it, and you need to talk about it in a way that actually makes your employees feel good. And making the employees feel good, it doesn't mean, you know what, this is what we have to do, or otherwise we'll go out of business. No, what makes them feel good is this is a new opportunity for you. We're going to be able to do so much more. We don't have to worry about some of the things that we had to worry about when we actually ran this as an independent company. There's a lot of stuff that we're going to be capable of doing. Look at all the stuff that they've done. Wouldn't you love to get your hands on this graphic engine, this analytics platform, all the stuff that they have, right? And but also when I'm sorry, this is a long answer to a very short question, but it's an important one. Make sure that when you're actually having your employees talk to the buyer, you tell them, listen, this is what they're looking to get from you, right? You have to almost kind of put them in a box, right? So CFO is not talking about the, the features of the game engine, and the CTO is not talking about, your P&L, right? And I made that mistake. I had an engineer that basically I said, hey, it's a great opportunity. There's a lot of things that this company brings to the table. So he went up there and he actually started grandstanding in front of the buyer, saying, I'm such a great engineer. Everything I wrote is great, but everything that these guys did was complete crap. So what did that do? Well, that, all of a sudden the buyer went in and said, okay, well, we've got to take a look at all the stuff that we thought was okay. So, we had to do a little bit of backpedaling. So.
Okay, so I think you mentioned the term earnout. So for the benefit of those of us in the room who are not necessarily familiar with the meaning of the term earnout, maybe you can give some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So, earnouts are basically after the deal is signed, you've got some certain amount in cash or a certain amount in stock. And then you get a certain amount after you hit certain milestones after the sale of the business. Those milestones may be there. It's basically everything you can imagine. All these employees stay, or particular team members stay. You hit a certain revenue number. You hit a certain EBITDA, which is your profitability. Or you release a certain game on time. Being a game developer, I say that's probably not one that you want to sign, right? But, there are all kinds, right? And it goes to the meat of really what is the buyer trying to get from you? What is it that they're trying to buy you for? What is that value that they're trying to get? From our perspective, earnouts are not the cake. They're the icing on the cake. The cake is your immediate, what you get at the consummation of the transaction. The cash, maybe some sort of stock consideration.
I think it leaves me to thank Daniel for his insightful comments. Will you please join me to thank him? Thank you so much.